Fantasy is silver and scarlet, indigo and azure, obsidian veined with gold and lapis-lazuli. Reality is plywood and plastic, done up in mud brown and olive drab. Fantasy tastes of habaneros and honey, cinnamon and cloves, rare red meat, and wines as sweet as summer. Reality is beans and tofu, and ashes at the end. J.R.R. Martin. Hello writers, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sandra. I share writing tips, writing inspiration, as well as my creative journey. Today I want to talk about one of my favorite topics ever, and it's fantasy. And specifically, I want to talk about how to write fantasy and fantasy novels. Now, I'm going to keep this video short and sweet, and that's because in the future I will talk more about fantasy, I'll share more tips, and I'll share all the different aspects of fantasy. But right now I'm going to keep it short and sweet for people that are new writers of the fantasy genre. Before we get to my 7 steps as to how to write fantasy, I just want to briefly give a little definition of fantasy. Fantasy is a genre of speculative fiction. It normally contains magical elements that are rooted in mythology and folklore. Think of fairies, dragons, elves, and the likes. Think of Game of Thrones, think of Lord of the Rings, think of all these popular fantasy novels that we're all used to reading and watching. But just remember, fantasy can extend further on than that, and you can even create your own fantastical creatures. Having this short definition out of the way, let's go right into my 7 steps as to how to write fantasy. My first step is read fantasy. Yes, you guys all know that I will always recommend reading as a tip, and this is no different. You need to read fantasy in order to understand fantasy. Reading fantasy will literally explain to you how the genre works. It will literally give you an idea of what you can do in fantasy, because there's a lot that you can do in fantasy, but there's a lot that you have to do successfully or else you will lose your readers. So the best thing to do is to read a lot of fantasy works, watch a lot of fantasy works, but especially read a lot of fantasy works so you can understand the genre even more. So I'm just going to list some of the most popular fantasy series and fantasy authors to get you started and to get you inspired. So these are no way, shape, and forms the only fantasy that exists. Like literally we have a lot of fantasy authors, a lot of fantasy novels, and it's amazing, and the genre keeps on growing every single year. But these next few authors and their works are the ones that most people read when they first get into fantasy. Obviously we have J.R.R. Tolkien with The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Martin with A Game of Thrones, Branden Sanderson with the Mistborn series, Robert Jordan with the Wheel of Time series, Neil Gaiman with the Sandman series and other of his novels, and we even have Stephen King with his Dark Tower series and other of his novels. We have Cassandra Clare and The Mortal Instruments and other books and series set in the Shadowhunter world that she created. We have Sarah J. Maas's series A Throne of Glass and A Court of Thorn and Roses. We have Ursula K. Le Guin and her Earthsea series, and obviously we have J.K. Rowling and her Harry Potter series. So now that you start to read a lot of fantasy and you start to read different kinds of fantasy, because we have different kinds of fantasy, this is when you start to understand fantasy. So now we've reached my 2nd step, which is understanding fantasy. We need to understand that in fantasy novels there are always fantastical elements that actually makes it a fantasy novel. Fantasy stems and roots from mythology and folklore, like I said, and a lot of the classic books that we know that are fairy tales that are set in the medieval times, etc., like even the first book that has ever been written, the Gilgamesh, also has fantastical elements. So fantasy has been around for a very long time. Once you start to understand how folklore works, how myths work, even when you dig deeper in your research of fantasy, then you will start to see more and more links and understand that a lot of the fantasy that are written now, it doesn't matter how modern they are or how different the complex ideas are, they still stem from the same familiar themes and same familiar elements of fantasy. So now that you're familiarized, now that you understand the fantasy genre, we are going to go to step number 3. Step number 3 is choosing a fantasy genre. So I listed some of them here, but there are many more subgenres. So we have high fantasy, low fantasy, epic fantasy, portal fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, dark fantasy, fantasy romance. So those are the few that I listed. Obviously there are more than those ones, but those are like, I think, some of the most popular fantasy genres. So make sure when you read fantasy books or when you create your fantasy books, understand and know exactly the subgenres you're choosing. If you want to learn more about subgenres, just shoot me a message or comment down below, and maybe I'll make an entirely different video on subgenre, because that would make this video way too long right now. So just know which subgenre you want to write. Is it portal fantasy, like are people going through something and discovering a new world, like Narnia, the wardrobe? Is it high fantasy, where the whole world is set in fantasy and magic and different from our world? Is it urban fantasy, where it's set in our world, or half and half, set half in our world, half in a magical world, and the characters are dealing with real world issues and they're dealing with magical issues as well? And then also don't forget to choose your audience and to adapt your themes and characters in accordance to the audience that you're choosing. Because it could be that you're writing children's fantasy, it could be that you're writing young adult fantasy, or you can be writing adult fantasy. So make sure whatever you write is appropriate for your audience. Now we're at step number 4, and it's to develop your magic system. So I just want to remind you here that it doesn't matter how small of a role magic plays in your fantasy novels, like say if you're writing low fantasy or urban fantasy, you still need to define your magic system. You still need to know how it works and what are the limitations. Essentially, you need to make rules for your magic system. You need to make rules to the magic, and you need to make sure that your characters don't break these rules, because if they break these rules or if they bend these rules, unless it's very purposeful and you're doing this masterfully, your readers will not believe in your magic. They will not believe in your magical worlds and your magical system, because you don't even follow the rules. You can literally create any type of magic system you want. Like, nothing is too out there in a magical setting. However, like I said, if your rules are not respected, if your rules contradict each other, then your readers will be taken out of the story. I know I repeated this like now 3 times, but this is a very, very important tip. Essentially, you have to see the magic system as the extra glue to your world building and to your characters. But for the magic and the magic system to be respected and to work, you also need to make sure to build a strong world. So step number 5 is develop your world. The reason why world building is so important in fantasy is that it's actually going to impact your plot. The world is not there just to look pretty. It's not there just to be forgotten about. The world directly impacts the magic and the limitation of magic, and it also impacts your plot. Essentially, your characters' lives and possibly their magical abilities will depend on the environment and the world that they live in. Here are certain things you should consider when building your world: the customs, traditions, norms, values, and culture of your world, environment factors such as the weather, geography, and resources, the species, magic, and so many more. And the different species, they can either be invented or taken straight from the mythology, folklore, or your traditional fantasy genres. And I would say you have to even know the morality, the philosophy, and the inner politics of your world to make sure that everything works perfectly. I like to also consider sometimes art and culture, even in a magical world and magical setting. So like, what kind of art is accepted, what kind of art is frowned upon. It could even be that your art is a way to produce magic, so some of it can be limited, some of it could be subjugated to imprisonment, etc. There are so many things that you can do with magical world building. And also, don't be afraid to put in real world topics and issues. It doesn't mean that it's a fantasy book that it doesn't have classism, racism, sexism, different power dynamics, and then the typical problems that we have us as individuals, such as money problems, addiction, mental health, physical ailments, loss, grief, etc. Like, all of these things are still valid in a fantasy form. But please do make sure you write about these topics respectfully, and if some of these topics are new to you, make sure that you do good research, and then make sure that you find good beta readers as well. Step number 6 is to build strong characters. The characters of your fantasy books are impacted by your world building, your magic, as well as the plot. So when you build your characters, you really need to take into consideration your plot, and your world and the magic system in order for them to have a direct or a secondary impact on your characters and your side characters. Furthermore, I think that even an unoriginal fantasy plot that's been done so many times before can be original depending on the strength of your characters. When you write strong and amazing characters, it's very possible that people will literally overlook the fact that your plot is very much formulaic. Because what is the point of a super elaborate, super original plot if your characters are so boring and that people can't relate or understand or care about your characters? Imagine killing off your characters and your readers just don't feel anything about it. You risk losing your readers super early on if your characters are not interesting. Your characters need to be realistic. They need motives, they need flaws, they need strengths, they need everything. But most importantly, they need some kind of growth. Even if it's a hero character turning into a villain, that's still a kind of growth or spiritual or physical change that's happening. Think of some of the most well-crafted characters in fantasy and fiction. Think about why you love them so much or why you dislike them so much. And the characters that you're indifferent from, think about why they don't cause you any type of emotion. Those are things that you need to study in order to understand how yourself you can build great and amazing impactful characters, even if they're the villain, even if they're the hero, or even if they're somewhere in between. I also highly recommend reading The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler because it's really an insight into how to write amazing characters and how to write an amazing plot according to your character. It has such a deep dive in the hero's journey that it will walk you through everything. It's a really thick book, and it will also walk you through the typical archetypes that we have and how we can even subvert these type of character archetypes. And he uses new and old examples both in film and in literature. So I highly recommend this book. So the last and final step for this video is to outline. Now this is even more important if you're planning a fantasy series. Fantasy is one of the genres that you can't pants, like as in you can't write at the seat of your pants without an outline and just go in there blind. Your story needs to be thought out and consistent. Normally, fantasy novels have a large or larger cast of characters, bigger plots, bigger subplots, and a lot of interweaving in between the two. Essentially, it requires you to know who's who, what's what, and what's going on at all times, even when your readers are not supposed to know. If you, as a writer, cannot distinguish what's going on, who's who, what's going to happen next, and what's going to come forward, then your readers are going to be even more lost than you are. And like I said, the fantasy plotline and storyline is normally much more complex and much more dragged out. So if it's too predictable or way too complex or way too unreadable for your readers, you risk losing them. And not only that, you risk not having them for the next book. You really need to consider having an outline and really developing as much as you can, because fantasy books, they start at 120,000 words and upwards. So if you lose your character in the first 10 to 20,000 words, what are you doing with those 100,000 words? You will literally be losing time. You will literally not have the success that you want for your book and your book series. You're gonna discourage yourself, and honestly, it's just not a good look. So when you outline and you carefully think about what scenes come first and what information and piece of information comes first, you can reveal as you go. You can build slowly, or you can build the momentum as you reveal your characters, the world, the magic. The last thing you want to do is dump everything in the first few pages and then never talk about it again and just have flat characters and a flat story and a flat magic system. Plus, when you outline, you can add all the appropriate clues and nuggets for your fantasy book, and not only that, for the series to come. So that means when you're writing the second and third book, you already have something to work from. You already have things that are making sense. The last thing you want to have is 2 books in the same series that make no sense, that have literally contradictions, and that just don't work together. So those were my 7 steps as to how to write fantasy. I hope this was helpful. If you're new to the genre or if you're a veteran of fantasy, I hope that you enjoyed these steps. I hope that you will consider them, and I hope that you will share your own tips and steps down below. Fantasy can be a little bit intimidating, it can be a little bit daunting, but take it at your own pace. Do the research, do the reading, you know, find your love for fantasy first before even considering writing a fantasy book. Once you have that, I'm telling you, it's just going to become easier and easier. The more immersed you are in fantasy, the more easier fantasy becomes, and you can start slow, start with like simple, complex, like I said, and then enrich them as you go. Like I said, having an outline is really what's going to save you here with fantasy, because you won't get too lost or you won't get too stuck. And even if you do, at least you have something to fall back on. You have your magic system, you have your characters, you have your plot, you have everything that you need. So don't be stressed and just take it easy. Fantasy takes a little bit more time than other books and other genres, so be prepared to expect that. And yeah, like I said, in the future I'm going to talk more about fantasy, so let me know what kind of fantasy topics you want to hear about next, because I myself am working on 3 types of fantasy. I'm working on low fantasy, high fantasy, and urban fantasy. These are projects that I have in the next 5 to 10 years envisioned in my mind. That's why I've done a lot of research and reading in the fantasy genre, and I've also started my own fantasy novel. If you like this video, like, comment, and subscribe. I would love to have you here. There are more writing videos coming every Wednesday and Friday, so stay tuned with that. And then I'll also have other vlogs and other types of writing videos coming up as well. As always, all my links, the channels, and the things that I talk about will be down below. For now, I'm gonna go and write. Don't forget to enjoy your journey to writing, and I'll see you on the next writing video. Bye!
I guess you're back. Are you gonna tell me where you went? All the messages I sent with no reply. It's like that.